Good morning to my modern world history students. This is a very quick YouTube video lesson going over 6 slides about absolutism and constitutional monarchs and how they play a role in the time period of colonization. I know that this isn't maybe the most exciting topic in the world, but all of these different interactions around the world are going to bring us into an age of revolution. So we're going to talk about heads being chopped in the French Revolution, the American Revolution, obviously being probably the most famous of revolutions. We'll talk about the Haitian Revolution and other places as well. But before we get to that time period, we really need to lay the foundation of how Europe truly dominated the world in the 15s, 16s, and 1700s. So I'm going to go over this quick lesson with you, and then you have one assignment for today, and that is looking at a video about the Native American perspective about this time period. It's a 10-minute TED Talk video, and it is a phenomenal video. It's a Native American speaker talking about how a lot of Americans today view Native Americans. Oftentimes we think of them as very stereotypical images that we find through our media and history books, right? And how to kind of navigate through that misconception about what it means to be a Native American, right? So that is your assignment for today. And then you only have 4 guided questions. So let's go ahead and get started. This slideshow is already on Schoology under our Unit 1. And I'm going to go ahead and just share the PowerPoint with you, but it is there if you want to go back and look at it. So we've been talking about absolutism, absolute control, total control that kings and queens have typically and traditionally throughout Western Europe in the 15s and 1600s. Sorry, I just kicked off my shoes. But these monarchs, remember that they believed in divine right. So God gave me the right to rule. And at this time in history, at least for Europe, Christianity dominated society. And to question God's will was a very dangerous thing to do. Traditionally, you could be burned at the stake. Books would be burned. Maybe even you were executed by axe, depending on where you're from, right? So it was a dangerous interaction to have in society. But we're going to start seeing that people during the same time period are going to question scientific reasonings and question their government. So that, again, goes with the Age of Revolution. So today is all about colonialism and monarchs. Okay, so how did monarchs, both absolute and constitutional, colonize the world? Okay, so first let's define what colonialism is. Okay, according to the National Geographic, this is a control by one power over a specific or dependent area or people. Okay, so Age of Exploration, I know you guys are familiar with, Christopher Columbus obviously being one of the most famous explorers, but we had explorers all over the world in the 14 and 1500s that found, quote unquote, found the New World, right? And historians even argue that we had other groups that explored even before Christopher Columbus. Historians argue that Leif Erikson, a Viking, centuries before, quote unquote, discovered America. The reason why I keep saying discover is people were already living in the Americas, right? So nothing was really discovered, but that's how history is written. Okay, so why did people colonize the world at this time? Always remember the 3 Gs. You might be familiar with this in elementary school, middle school, but these are the main reasons why Europe decides we're going to go out and create settlements elsewhere and really impact and influence positively and negatively the world around them. So the three G's, you have God, okay? A lot of people, priests in particular, believe that missionaries are supposed to go out and spread the word of God and convert as many people as possible to Christianity. And so because there were such diverse groups of people that were not Christians, these Europeans believed that they were uncultured and savages, right? And so that's why we want to give a little bit more voice to these smaller minority groups like the Native Americans and Africans during the time period, because we're going to see both sides of the story here. Okay. We're not going to just look at the European perspective, but we want to see the experiences and impact that it had on other groups as well. So that's one reason. Another reason is gold. How much money can we make for our empire or our kingdom, right? So that is a concept of mercantilism. So that's profitable trading with others. Last but not least, glory. Putting your name out there for the rest of the world. Who is the most powerful empire? Who has the most strength, right? And who's kind of going to play on this world stage. So colonialism starts out 15, 16, 1700s. It will later be changed to what's called imperialism. Imperialism is when not only are they colonizing these different places, but they start to play a larger role in the political and social and economic aspects of these societies. And so people had to fight for their independence against European domination. Okay. So who in particular participated in colonizing? Lots of Western European nations, but the major players were Portugal, England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands, or the Dutch. And so when they came to the approach of how to colonize, this is called cultural assimilation. If you've taken geography before, you might be familiar with this term. Maybe you've heard of the American melting pot. This is a belief in like blending cultures together. And so a lot of the times these smaller, more minority cultures like the Native American tribes were expected or even forced to conform to their cultural traditions. A lot of the times 1800s too, Native Americans were forced to cut their hair, and depending on the tribe, they didn't cut their hair unless they were mourning a loss. They were expected to learn English. They were expected to change their clothing. They were expected to go to Christian schools. They were forced out of their homes. So, you're going to be our version of, Western European tradition, or, maybe you'll even be killed, right? So, unfortunately, the Europeans wash away or wipe out a lot of the deeply rooted traditions of the Native American tribes. So we'll talk more about that. But assimilation is not a common ground. It's not acculturation where they just simply adopt these different traditions. They were expected to change. Okay. So I love this map because it says countries that have been under European control, and then it has different colors. If you look at the light green, it says partial European control or influence, but if you look at the darker green, colonized or controlled by Europe. So that's dark green, a massive part of our world will be dominated by Europe. In fact, England in itself, when we get to imperialism, which is kind of like the next step to colonization, there's a famous quote that says, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," because anywhere that you're at in the world, there's going to be British dominance. Okay. So where do they participate? The Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia. And then later, places like China and Japan will also be drawn into conflict with the Western European influence. And then that is called imperialism. And a lot of different places like China and Japan were not willing and not okay with opening up their borders of trade with Europe. And that will cause a lot of conflict. Particular events I can think of off the top of my head are the Opium Wars, which we'll talk about, and the Boxer Rebellion. Okay. All right, so before we talk about which different monarchs ruled and colonized different places, we're going to look at there's two types of monarchs. So we've learned about so far absolute monarchs, but we haven't talked about constitutional. So when we look at absolute, absolute is the older tradition of kings and queens, but later, especially in England, if you want to write this down somewhere, England is going to be kind of off the beaten path in history, and a lot of them will be constitutional. So, what is the difference between the two? Absolutism, so sovereignty or self rule, is in the divine right to rule. So I am queen because God intended me to be queen, and you wouldn't question God's will, right? What I say goes. And so there's a lot of oppression that's found in the lower classes, the impoverished people. You don't have a lot of individual rights. Um, and so places like Europe, France, and Spain traditionally will participate in absolute monarchs. Okay. There are lists of philosophers that we'll talk about when we get into the Enlightenment era. Maybe you've heard of Thomas Hobbes before. I know for a fact that you guys have heard of John Locke, whether or not you remember who he is. Okay. So, constitutionalism, this is the belief that people chose their sovereign king or queen, and they have a limitation to their rule through a constitution. That constitution is supposed to represent the people. Okay. So, that is the protection and the rights of people. This ensures more freedoms and liberties to the common man. Okay. John Locke helped to inspire Thomas Jefferson in our writing of Declaration of Independence. So we have these rights that we're born with and cannot be taken away. Those are called our inalienable rights. Okay, we'll talk more about that. But other places that participated in constitutional monarchies, there's some that are in ancient Roman empires, but again, predominantly in England, and we'll see some in the Netherlands as well. So here's just a list. We'll go into detail of these later, but a list of some major monarchs that play a role during this time period. Louis XIV of France, he was probably the best example of an absolute monarch. We have the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I of England. She will be a constitutional monarch. But then she has a relative, because she didn't have any kids, so she has King of Scotland ends up being King of England as well. James the First of England will say, yeah, no, I'm going to be an absolute monarch. That's going to start a civil war in England. And then you have Philip II of Spain as an absolute monarch. So I feel like I gave you a lot of information in one day, and I apologize. I tried to make this as sweet, short, and simple and to the point. So major lesson of today is what colonialism is, the reasons for colonialism, and then some of those major influencers or monarchs that participated in it. All right, go ahead and get on to your Native American guided video questions next.